So far, this apocalypse has not lived up to my expectations. Not at all. Yep. Anyway, so we got some dark subject matter to talk about today. And I've been getting some feedback from the final papers, which I've had a couple of questions I want to address in video. These final papers, all the discussion questions, everything we've done this semester, it is all due May the 4th. And I would like to say that I did that on purpose. May the 4th be with you. But no, it's not. That's just kind of how the schedule worked out. So we have a week for you guys to finish this stuff. Now, I would really like to just kind of focus on Heart of Darkness today, just to kind of throw out a few last points on this. And as far as I'm concerned, for the papers and everything, guys, just write it. Just write it. Just get it done. Submit it. I'll go back and make sure that the drop boxes are open for unlimited submission, so you guys can, kind of have multiple attempts at that if it's necessary. Now, buddy, come here. Come here. I hear you scratching around down there. So, Heart of Darkness. What? Anyway, so we get to the station, and we've talked about the severed heads on pikes. We've had our discussion question about what's up with the severed heads. Now, this is one of my favorite weird, kind of strange facts about the story that actually makes the reality of what happened in the Congo even worse than what Conrad shows us in the story. Kurtz was very likely based off of a real guy, a Belgian officer. Okay, you want down? I'll put you down. I got you. I ain't gonna make you sit here the whole time. A Belgian officer by the name of Leon Rom. Yeah, look this guy up because he was a nutcase. He was interesting. Now, Leon Rom does not seem to have been as outlandish and colorful a character as Kurtz was, but he was monstrously cruel. And one of the things that differentiates him from Kurtz at least takes the severed heads of his enemies and uses them in a kind of weird ceremonial manner, right? He does something with them that, at least from a primal case, makes sense. Like, if you're going up somewhere and you see a bunch of heads on pikes and you have a fully functioning brain, regardless of where they're facing, you're going to think to yourself, I probably shouldn't tick this guy off, right? I should probably mind my manners, as it were. Leon Rom, what he did was he started decapitating people in his station as punishment. But rather than use them in a ceremonial manner, he used the heads of his enemies to decorate his flower beds. That's even a little crazy for Conrad. Leon Rom had some type of absolute total break and just became horrible for the sake of horror. Even beyond what Kurtz recognizes in Apocalypse Now. The actual speech in Apocalypse Now, where Marlon Brando is talking about horror either as an enemy or an ally, decorating your flower beds with human heads is just straight up, okay, you need to take your meds, right? Something has gone horribly wrong. So in a lot of ways, Leon Rom is even worse, whether it just be out of pure insanity or like just pointless sadism. Now, we know that Marlowe knew about Leon Rom. I don't know if there's a actual confirmation that he ever actually interacted with him, or if he would have even, run into him in any sort of capacity. But he would have known about him and he would have known this story. Now, so on that note, we have a historical foundation for Kurtz's character, somebody who is supposed to be a civilized agent coming into an uncivilized area. And what ends up happening is he falls and becomes even darker than what existed there before. Now we finally get into a discussion about the real debate here. Now, this is going to be a really cool kind of close application of post-colonial theory. So if you're in the middle of this paper about post-colonialism, this might give you an idea how to jump into this. Conrad has a very complicated relationship with race, because even though Heart of Darkness kind of turned the world's eye to the stuff that was going on in the Congo, he's still racist as hell, right? He has a lot of themes and a lot of stuff going on in Heart of Darkness that are just so unbelievably bad. And one of these is kind of an uncomfortable discussion of the theme itself. And the theme here, obviously, is getting closer and closer to that heart of evil, that heart of darkness, as it were. The Europeans, the colonial powers, thought of themselves as a force that was bringing civilization to these uncivilized areas. They were supposed to be a beacon in an otherwise dark world. This did not turn out to be true, because the colonial powers ended up causing nightmarish situations to occur even faster than what the supposedly savage indigenous people were doing to themselves. The debate, though, about Heart of Darkness is where exactly did the savagery of Kurtz come from? Was it something he brought with him, or was it something he found there? As disturbing as this question is, it's a really important one, because Conrad depicts this as very, very uncertain. It's hard for us to tell exactly what the origin of all of this is. Kurtz comes in, and there's a bit of a collapse in his Western education, and he thinks of himself as a civilizing force, but he realizes that the savagery of the native people are what must be used in order to properly control them, right? But all the darkness and all the horror and all the nightmares seem to come from his acquiescing, from his acceptance of these people and adopting their customs. Now, probably the biggest thorn in the side of people who like the story is the second wife. The wife of Kurtz that he takes while in Congo. That is a strange relationship. And the funny thing is if you watched Apocalypse Now, there is actually a correlation to that. Kurtz in that story actually has a young female figure who is following him around as well. This female figure seems to have some type of control over Kurtz. It's a weird relationship, and it's really hard to figure out what exactly they have going on. She is his wife, and they seem to be weirdly equal. And when they try to pull Kurtz away from this situation, when they try to take him back, she's the one who fights the hardest. This relationship, I think, suggests that for Conrad, there was an even kind of, and I know I'm getting really esoteric here, but this book is actually extremely philosophical and esoteric in kind of the wrong ways. There's an even take between the kind of analytical intelligence of the colonial power and the savage nature of the indigenous people, that they kind of form a symbiosis. And it seems to me, and you guys, if you disagree with me, you could write about this, but I can't imagine any of you guys being like, I'm going to write about that. It seems to me that it reads more like Kurtz was tainted by a darkness that exists in the heart of the Congo itself. That is so hideously problematic, so messed up, that as much as I love this story, we're left with a really, really just nauseating idea that it really seems like, I mean, Kurtz obviously brought some measure of darkness with him. At least I feel like that's the way it is. But it's like it went into overdrive when he found himself isolated in the Congo, in the jungle, with these native people that he began to emulate their ways, right? And that was the source of the heart. Now think for a minute about how problematic this is from a post-colonial standpoint. From that standpoint, it's almost like it's hard for us to stop and actually really think about this story, and because we kind of want to always sort of like wag our finger at the colonial powers. No, you are the source of the crud. You're the reason that everything was messed up, right? And when you look at the history of Africa itself, I've gotten into debates on this point many, many times, and I'm going to stick by it now. It seems to me that the colonial history of Africa is the source of almost all of their woes in modern history. If it hadn't have been for the things that colonial powers introduced, Africa might have had a much better chance of becoming an economic stronghold, much more than we see it today. Right now, Africa's real economic power is based upon the West's exploitation of them. And it's funny because you might think that this is all just stuff that you would talk about in a philosophy classroom or in a like a classroom where we're talking about race issues. But in actuality, pop culture has a tendency to just sort of break into this conversation occasionally. One of the best examples I can see of this is Wakanda. Wakanda from Black Panther and the Marvel movies is supposed to be a depiction of what Africa could have become if there hadn't been so much meddling in it, right? Wakanda's power comes from their isolation, right? And that's actually a big narrative that fuels some of our biggest comic book movies right now. It's a very pervasive idea. So for me, it's problematic to think of Kurtz being corrupted by some darkness that exists in the middle of Congo when Congo has been abused and abused and abused so much. Now, also keep in mind what I'm doing here. I'm saying it's problematic. I'm not saying we should throw it out. It's an amazing book, and it brings up a lot of points of contention, right? It forces us to look at some historical things that are extremely unsettling. And for me, a good book does that, right? Conrad was very much a man of his time. And that idea, and if you've ever heard this before, this is one of those things that can get you into a lot of trouble if you don't know what you're talking about. There's the phrase that people sometimes use, and it's in darkest Africa. That's what this heart of darkness thing is kind of talking about, is this darkness in the wilderness and in the jungles of Africa, that there's something wild and untamed about Africa, something almost evil lurking within it. Right? That's extremely problematic. We can talk about problematic books, though. We could talk about books and stories that make us uncomfortable, and we can discuss what's going on here. And the funny thing is, there's a lot of books that actually do this. One of my favorite examples, and dear Lord, if you could ever avoid reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom's Cabin is probably the book that's most responsible for the abolitionist movement in America. That book almost started the Civil War on its own. It's very famous. And in a lot of ways, Conrad kind of accomplished something very similar in that this Heart of Darkness caused people to look at what's going on in Africa and look at the abuse and look at all the horrible things that were happening, even though it ended up being something that I think is very extremely racist at its core. If you ever have the misfortune of reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I say misfortune just because it is a very unpleasant book. It is crazy unpleasant book. But if you ever have the misfortune of reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's hideously racist. Like, probably one of oh God, it nauseates me to think about. Let me give you a quick idea of what Uncle Tom's Cabin actually suggests. Now, again, the primary goal of Uncle Tom's Cabin is to say racism bad, right? We should abolish racism. Racism is a horror. It is a monstrosity upon the earth that that God will not bear any longer. It makes that point pretty well. But along the line, as it's making the point that racism, that slavery is bad, it also has a very keen statement to make about the nature of Africans. And the characters who have mixed lineage, who have white ancestry and black ancestry, are all much more intelligent than the Africans depicted, who are darker skinned. Uncle Tom himself is a sacrificial lamb kind of character, and he's depicted as almost being innocent and to the point of helplessness. Going back to the idea of Flannery O'Connor, that innocence is kind of useless, only to be sacrificed for the benefit of people who are sinful, right? And Uncle Tom is very much an embodiment of that. And it makes the point overtly that mixed race people are capable of more. I remember sitting in a survey of literature class in graduate school and reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I was literally like, what? I thought this was supposed to be like one of the most virtuous books ever written. And I was nauseated. I was like, that's horrifying. And the way my teacher discussed it with us was to say, yeah, it's awful. And we have to understand it for what it actually is. It's not a book that you should just praise. It has dimensions. It was very hard for people writing back then not to have ideas like that. So many of them had those ideas as a matter of course. And if you think about it, it's actually kind of amazing that a book could straddle the line between such blatantly racist ideas and still advocate no, slavery is wrong. Like, a really true, careful study of literature is not going to solve any problems. If anything, it complicates everything and shows you just kind of at once how messed up the world is and how there are little glimmers of light everywhere. And we just have to kind of go back and put all those puzzle pieces back ourselves. And that's one of the things that's interesting about the idea right now of cancel culture. Cancel culture, where someone says something really horrible and then they get deplatformed, I'm not against that because, I mean, that's kind of society just doing what society does. But if we were to completely throw out Uncle Tom's Cabin or Heart of Darkness, we would miss a lot of really interesting things about it, right? We would miss a lot of what the history of it has to tell us. So I think cancel culture makes a lot of sense in the moment, right? But as history unfolds, at some point, people in the future are going to have to return to the things that got canceled. They're going to have to return to it and look at it in its context and try to figure out what those awful things were trying to tell us. Anyway, as far as a discussion question goes, let's make this simple for attendance. I want you to go back into the Heart of Darkness forum, your choice. I know I made like 3 of them. And I want you to tell me what your favorite part of the book has been so far. Wednesday, I'm going to have one more lecture about Conrad, and we'll finish it off with a discussion of the ending, which is another one of those things that's just jolly good, right? So anyway, you guys have a lovely afternoon, and here's to the end.